Hi everybody. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the topic of language learning, and in particular I wanted to talk about what I would say is the biggest mistake that I have ever made, and in particular one that has set me back honestly about 10 years in terms of just what I've been able to accomplish and what I've been able to get out of that language. So I had a pretty typical exposure to language learning in the very beginning that I think a lot of people have. I started learning French in high school because it was basically just that I had to pick a language, and I was like, okay, I'll learn French, I guess. And I was not particularly into it. And also at the time, I sort of had this perspective that the way that you learn a language is that you spend some time memorizing it. Once you know it, then that's it. Basically, you know the language, you can use it forever. That's it, boom, done. It's like riding a bicycle. You never have to worry about it again. At the same time, I never really understood why it was so difficult for me. I was not finding that I was memorizing things quickly. There were just huge lists of conjugations that I had to memorize that I could never remember. I was always falling asleep in class, and I just never really made a lot of progress. And so I took French for 4 years of high school, and I didn't really learn very much out of it. I never really got beyond a beginner's level. Then I ended up going to university, and I ended up going to a university where, in particular, our university was very focused on the process of studying abroad. That was a big thing. They highly encourage everybody to study abroad, and as a result, a lot of people do in their junior year. And if you actually don't go on study abroad, then you are in the minority that stay behind. Basically, what I decided to do was, okay, I figured I have learned a bit of French from high school. I took a couple more classes on French to just get myself prepared, and then I ended up doing a study abroad program in Strasbourg, France. This changed things pretty significantly because I saw for the first time what happens when you really are forced to use a language regularly. You get constant exposure to it. You learn very rapidly. And I was discovering that I didn't have to do all this memorizing. I didn't have to do all of the sort of, sitting down and worrying about conjugations and lists of words and things like that. Instead, what I found was that I was just learning the language naturally from having exposure to it constantly and being forced to use it. And I learned very rapidly, and I got to a pretty decent level of proficiency. It made me enjoy learning the language a lot more, and it made me seem to, for the first time, really understand why you learn languages. You learn languages to interact with people in those languages. And when you're doing it, back in the United States with basically no one to talk to, it feels very much like a pointless intellectual exercise and less of a, sort of like learning a living language and actually getting to use it and actually getting to enjoy it in the process. Still, at the time, things didn't really click for me. I came home from that study abroad program and I basically just stopped practicing entirely and never really did anything with the language again. I would, do some little bits and pieces of things here and there. I might find a French language film and say, yeah, I'll watch that and kind of struggle through it with subtitles. Or I might, pick out a book here and there and kind of try and make an attempt at reading it and struggle and then end up putting it down and just not getting very far. I did try Duolingo for a little bit with French. It didn't really help. I didn't really find that it was enjoyable or meaningful. And so I tried a lot of different things, but nothing really worked. I've also made another video specifically about why I don't like Duolingo, why I think it's not a great way to learn a language. And of course, as well, another video about basically my recommended tips for learning a language, my process that I'm using now, which is much more effective than what I was doing back then. It started to click for me, I would say, for the first time when I moved to Denmark and I started learning Danish. And this time around, I had a lot more experience of learning languages. I had a lot more of a sense of the actual skill of learning. That's something that people talk about a lot when it comes to language learning. We tend to think that people who are very young, babies, for example, pick up languages very rapidly. But the reality is that they just have a lot of constant exposure to it. And of course, it's the language that they have to learn first before they can communicate with anyone. So of course, they're going to start using it. Of course, they're going to develop a proficiency in it. When you're an adult, yes, things are harder in the sense that you have a lot of everyday commitments, routines, habits, and so on holding you back and making it harder to actually spend time immersing yourself in a language. But at the same time, as an adult, you can also have a lot more perspective. You can have a lot more experience and practice, and that enables you to learn languages more rapidly. And so coming into Danish, I had this experience of kind of mucking around in French for, at that point, about a decade or so, basically just losing all that I was learning and not really learning very much. And this time around, I wanted to do it right. I wanted to do it the right way. I wanted to make sure that I was not wasting my time and I was not losing all of the effort that I was putting into this. And I would say that the main mistake that I made with French that I learned not to make when I was learning Danish was simply that you need to actually be able to continue practicing it forever. It's not something where you start off, you learn the language, and then it's permanently in your brain. The reality is that over time, things just fall off. If you don't practice things, you lose them. And as a result, I stopped practicing French or meaningfully attempting to practice French on a consistent basis, and I basically lost most of it. Yes, I remember some of the conjugation. Yes, I remember some of the vocab. But when I look at now, my confidence, my ability to speak, my ability to comprehend, it's significantly worse than it was when I was actually living in France. And that's simply because I have not practiced anything in about the decade since I actually lived there. This lesson applies to basically anything that you want to master, anything that you want to get good at. There is no way to get good at anything without doing a lot of constant practice. This applies, of course, to fitness as well. You work out regularly because it is that regular process of working out that causes your body to continue to adapt. And at a certain point, yes, maybe you are just maintaining, but that's still better than losing everything that you've built. And the same thing applies to any skill. The same thing applies to learning guitar, learning to code, learning a new language, etc. There are certain things where we say that it's like riding a bike and that you can always pick it back up pretty easily. There are certain skills that are simple enough that you can basically always pick them up. But when it comes to more complex skills, which take a lot longer to learn, a lot longer to master, you need to keep practicing them basically forever, or you are going to start losing what you have built. And so what I see this time around is that I learned Danish starting at about 5 years ago. I have been consistently practicing it every single day since then, even if it's a little bit, maybe doing a little bit of flashcards, maybe doing a little bit of listening, maybe writing a few sentences. A big help there has been the fact that I have made a lot of Danish friends, especially on Twitter, and that means that I have constant exposure to the language. I have a constant reason to use the language, and that helps me keep it maintained. Likewise, now that I am picking French back up after, again, about 10 years of letting it stagnate, I am planning on actually making this into something that I am doing long-term, that I am practicing long-term, and that I am sticking to every single day, as opposed to once every 3 months I pick up a book and put it down because I get frustrated. This also means that you need to have a sustainable method for practicing something. If it is a situation in which the method of practice you are attempting to use is so hard or so difficult that you can't do it consistently, then clearly that is not the right way to practice. That is not the way that is going to be best for you. If it is something that you cannot do consistently, it's not going to work out long term, and you should instead focus on finding what will work in the long term. What does tend to happen over time is that when you are more expert at a skill, when you have practiced a skill for longer, it does take longer to start decaying. So if you've been practicing a skill for, say, 10 years, then you can take some time off. And yeah, you might lose a little bit, but it won't be very much because you have simply ingrained that skill, those neurological patterns in there much more deeply than someone who, for example, takes 1 month to learn a skill and then completely drops it. So it's important to recognize that it is important and it is meaningful and useful to take breaks periodically. When you have been consistently practicing for a very long time, maybe you need to take a week off, maybe you need to take 2 weeks off, maybe you need to take a month off. Those things happen. But the thing is that you need to have a plan for picking it back up. You can't just turn that into, okay, this 2 weeks off turns into, okay, you're just never going to practice it again. It needs to be something that is planned. It needs to be something that you are actually thinking about and planning for in the long term. I also simply want to point out that when you are planning on learning something and then you're planning on not having some way to practice it over time in the long run, then that was basically just a waste of your time. Why would you spend, for example, 2 years learning a language if you then plan on never using it again? It seems a bit silly. All of that practice that you have to do in the future to maintain that skill may seem like a big commitment, but at the same time, it's a generally smaller commitment from day to day than you might think, and it also prevents all of that work from having gone to waste and having been just a huge waste of your time. I often tell people that if you want to get good at something, you need to be able to commit to it for at least a couple of years. This isn't something where you can get really good at anything within 6 months. Sure, yes, you can probably focus on the right kinds of practice and you can learn things pretty rapidly and you can get to a pretty good place very quickly. But at the same time, if you really want to be good at anything, you need to be able to commit to it for the very long term. And that's why I say that at the very minimum, something like a year or two is kind of what you need to be able to commit to ensure that you actually have the ability to train for it in the long term. I would also add to this simply that there is a difference between doing things that you enjoy and doing things that you hate. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two. And I know that that may sound a little silly to say. Obviously, you know what things you enjoy and what things you hate. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff where you think you enjoy it for a long period of time, and then maybe 6 months down the line, you sit down and say, do I really enjoy this? Is it really enriching my day? And you think about it, and you can't remember the last time it really brought you joy or made you happy. And that happens a lot of the time with a lot of the habits that end up being sort of dead weight in our lives, dead commitments, that we really realize later on down the line that we're not enjoying things. And so what I would say to that is that languages are a part of that as well. If you are not enjoying learning a language, then maybe it's just not the language for you. That's really all there is to it. Maybe it is at that point better to focus on quitting, to focus on jettisoning that wasted effort as quickly as possible, not letting the sunk cost fallacy keep you committed to a plan of action that you're not enjoying and that you're not getting anything out of, and instead focus on finding the things that you do enjoy and that you do get a lot out of. So at the end of the day, people who are good at things are not the people who hate those things generally. That's a pretty simple truism. The people who get to be world-class powerlifters, the people who get to be world-class language learners, the people who get to be world-class programmers, they are generally not people who hate that specific discipline. They're people who enjoy it for its own sake. And that enjoyment is what helps maintain your interest in it in the long run. It helps keep you practicing it in the long run so that you can actually continue to see improvements. You can actually continue to embed those neural patterns and get better and better. And so I would say, simply understand that you need to look very frankly at your language learning process. You need to say, hey, am I really enjoying this? Is it really meaningful to me? Is it really making me happy? And if not, then definitely don't waste another second trying to learn it. Instead, focus on finding something better to do with that time. So that's what I wanted to say for this week. As always, if you like the video, don't hesitate to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, comment, tell me what you want to see in future videos. Let me know what languages you are trying to learn. I'm very interested in hearing from everybody. As always, have a great week. I'll talk to you all next time. Bye.